We're the Good Doctors of Abbey Research. I'm Dr. Erin.
I'm Dr. Kristen.
And you are exceptionally welcome to a special edition of our Colonizers World Tour. Beep, 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 beep. If you know that we've been doing this for the better part of 2021, then you know we usually pick a given colonizer and then learn more about places they colonized. We've taken a couple months break. We're taking a couple months break after this. But because we are in the midst of Native American Heritage Month and we decided the Good Doctors Indigenous Peoples Awareness Week this week, we're doing some special Colonizers World Tour videos for you. So we've got our Indigenous Peoples 101 today. Tomorrow we'll be talking about the fantastic and fascinating new film Wild Indian. Thanksgiving Day, we've got a doozy of a hot-ish take where we're talking about why we need to unlearn Thanksgiving. It's all Indigenous all week here for the Good Doctors. You know, we believe in these weeks, whether we make them up or somebody else does, because they're a great opportunity to start conversations and get people resources and ideas and engagement so that hopefully we can just be aware of Indigenous folks all the time and not just this week. So that is the who's and the what's of where we are. We're going to dive into Indigenous Peoples 101 first. Dr. Kristen, what did you know about Indigenous peoples before we did this film?
More than anything else I've known about any other Colonizers World Tour video, for sure. Because I've been your best friend on your journey for your last couple of years in learning all of these things. So,
that's true.
And I have seen all of Rutherford Falls, which again just puts me ahead of every other place we've studied.
Yeah, no, it's really puts you ahead of the ball here.
I would say we've been intentionally aware of Indigenous folks for 4 years now, probably. You took up the mantle more than myself, but definitely I feel confident in that I know more than most Americans.
Oh, for sure.
And that I am in that beautiful position that academics get into, where it's like I'm confident in the handful of things I know, and excited to learn the ocean of things I don't.
Yeah.
So what about you?
Yeah, I put in here, a lot, but also not a lot. Because this is, and if you've seen our previous Native American Heritage Month coverage, I've talked a lot about this. Growing up in Colorado, I was exposed to a lot more indigeneity, both history and present day, than a lot of other folks in the United States. I had some honest history teachers that were honest about everything we did to the indigenous peoples of this land that is now the United States. But I still have learned so much. And every time, it feels like almost Northern Ireland in the way we talk about it, where every time I feel like I've grasped a level of understanding, something comes in and shakes it all up, which for giant nerds like Dr. Kristen and I is super exciting. Other people might find that discouraging or upsetting, but Dr. Kristen and I are oh, we got it wrong? How can we get it right? How can we learn more? So yeah, I feel like I know, it's not that I feel like, I know a lot more than most Americans, about the indigenous peoples of this land. But when it comes to indigenous folks around the world, we really learned so much in the Colonizers World Tour, because intentionally that was part of the reason we were doing it. So that's why I say a lot, but not a lot, because prior to this year, I had never heard of the Chamorro people of Guam, or the many different tribal identities in Fiji, or what it's like to be an indigenous person in Siberia. Indigenous folks are everywhere. So let's jump into our 101 and talk a little bit about some of what we have found, and we will share with you. This is the barest of the bare bones. Attached to this video, as per usual, is a living Google Doc that is literally every resource we've ever found about Indigenous peoples, and it's a lot. So we're just kind of sprinkling, we're what's that guy, Bay Salt or Salt Bay?
Salt Bay.
Salt Bay, we're just like sprinkling some salt in here to get the taste, and then you guys can like go learn on your own. So I would like to shout out and reference Notable Native Peoples, which just came out this year, by Adrienne Keene, who is one of the hosts of the All My Relations podcast, also runs the Native Appropriations blog. He's a Native person and academic and general discusser of these things. But in this book, she's got some great definitions for things. So thanks, Adrienne, for that. But her definition of Indigenous people are that they are the first people of the lands around the world. To be Indigenous is to be of a place, to have creation stories of how your people emerged from the land, and to be connected to a community from that place, which I thought was a beautiful and encompassing understanding of it, and that indigeneity goes way beyond, Native Americans in that sense. Also, we have official definitions from Amnesty International, what it means to be Indigenous. Most importantly, they self-identify as Indigenous peoples, usually the first step in anything. There is a historical link with those who inhabited a country or region at the time when people of different cultures or ethnic origins arrived. This is very Amnesty definitions. They have strong links to territories and surrounding national resources. We'll get into that a little bit more later on. They have distinct social, economic, or political systems. They have distinct language, culture, and beliefs. They are marginalized and discriminated against by the state. That is very important, and we'll get into human rights towards the end of this video. And they maintain and develop their ancestral environments and systems as distinct peoples. So that's like the spectrum of what it means to be Indigenous, and depending on which people group you're talking about, that can shift throughout the world in terms of those relationships. Indigenous peoples are also known as First Peoples, Aboriginal peoples, Native peoples. In some countries, in India and Nepal, there are specific words used for Indigenous folks. So that is important to remember as we're going around the world here. There are 370 million Indigenous people around the world, spread throughout 90 countries. They belong to more than 5,000 different Indigenous peoples, bigger like people groups, and speak more than 4,000 languages. They represent about 5% of the world's population. The vast majority of them live on the continent of Asia, almost 70% of them. And Indigenous peoples live in all regions of the world and own, occupy, or use 22% of the global land area. So they take up a lot of land, but they're a very small percentage of population, which gets into a lot of the discrimination and human rights issues that Indigenous peoples face. So, where to next, Dr. K?
Well, let's be really focused in this conversation on North America. And then we'll focus even more on the United States, because this is American Thanksgiving. And the reason we're having this conversation this week is because of American Thanksgiving. So there are 574 Native American federally recognized tribal nations. Now, what that gets them, nothing. But
broken treaties, lies.
Broken treaties, lies, a whole host of nothing. There's other state recognized ones, and then there's a host of ones that aren't recognized at all. So we're really probably looking, between 800 and 900 tribal identities within the legal bounds of the United States, and that includes Hawaii and Alaska. We also need to be aware, and we'll talk about this later on in 2022, I believe, that the purchase of Hawaii into becoming an American state is, again, a stealing of land from the Indigenous people of Hawaii. As well, this counts in Alaska as well, and there's some overlap in the Inuit tribes between Canada and the United States when it comes into the region of the Yukon and up into Alaska, which was almost entirely about gold. So let's remember that we're talking about not an insignificant number of people. I also want to give just a minor moment of grace and amnesty. If you can name more than one North American tribe, we think you're doing great. And good news is you can go up from here.
Yeah.
So it's not, the Cherokee is a nation, the Iroquois are a nation, the Haudenosaunee are a nation, and then they all break down into a whole lot of different things. So if you understand that Cherokee is a people and not just a brand of car, you are, I mean, 2 thumbs way up, guys. We're real proud of you. And now we move on.
Yeah, and the Iroquois Haudenosaunee is a great point before I move on, that a lot of times the names that we know for tribes are the names we gave them, which is very similar to how, humans, colonizers, and settler colonialism operates around the world. But, for example, you might have heard of the Chippewa people. That is the name that was given to them by the settlers. The name that a lot of those people choose to use is Ojibwe. The Iroquois Confederacy was a confederacy of 6, I think, tribal nations. The French gave them the name the Iroquois. The name that they have called themselves historically is Haudenosaunee. So it's a whole thing of layers. And, one of the things that is very difficult for white folks to understand is the intricacies of different native language groups, because they're not built on any kind of structure that we already understand. So a lot of words that you might not be able to pronounce, you don't know how to use the inflection, all of that jazz. We're not even going to get into native language speakers and the destruction of native language speakers, but it's a whole complicated sort of thing. But yeah, I mean, if you can name a couple, you're doing all right, because a lot of people can't even do that.
You're doing great.
You're doing great. So we're moving on to some gender issues, because we're the good doctors. We always love to talk about these. No shock, we spend a lot of times talking about intersectionality here on our YouTube channel. The intersection of indigeneity and gender doesn't go so great for Indigenous women. They face different obstacles, which are, any number of things. Their restricted ability to join the labor market, access to health and education services, access to social programs, really high rates of illiteracy around the world, low participation in the political process. And we've talked a lot on this channel. We have a podcast episode and YouTube videos, and coverage of other pieces of art dealing with murdered and missing Indigenous women and girls. So violence against Indigenous women is disproportionately high for their intersection. Discrimination contributes to the perception that Indigenous women are inferior, sexually available, which I liked that phraseology from. I was like, oh, okay, thanks, Amnesty. I think that's how we're saying promiscuous now.
Yes, it is. Yeah.
Sexually available, or easy victims. And this is one of the things we talked about when we talk about missing, murdered, and Indigenous women and girls, particularly in the United States, is a lot of times because they are seen as a vulnerable population, because of a whole host of factors, a lot of perpetrators see them as an easy target. Mm-hmm. The criminal justice system is hard to navigate. Who has jurisdiction? It makes it complicated. You're so far away from any sort of law enforcement. Like, it becomes a high risk situation for these folks. But we also know that ancestral lands are an essential part of Indigenous women's existence and culture. They are often seen as the protectors and custodians of cultural values and the guarantors of their people's survival. A lot of Indigenous groups around the world are matriarchal in structure instead of patriarchal, including the aforementioned some nations that made up the Haudenosaunee collective. So there's a strong belief that violations of the cultural rights of women are a form of spiritual violence because of the relationship that those women have to being the cultural protectors and being the land protectors as well. Speaking of land protectors, hey, look at that transition.
I think that if people know anything about Indigenous folks, they know that there's a connection with the land. I think that that's probably one of the things that has bled through all of the everything else. So we want you to know that's not a stereotype, that's a truism. And it is common around the world. And I want to go back to that definition that Dr. Aaron said at the very beginning about the relationship with the land being key to a Indigenous identity. And land is a huge deal of any Indigenous group. Honestly, I think about even one of the stereotypes that I joke about Irish people is that Irish people have to own land to feel like they've arrived because the British took so much land from them. And it's not a small thing. Like, for my husband to understand himself as both an Irishman who has arrived, he had to own land. And that was something that I mocked, I'll completely admit, because that's not, I've always belonged to, except for my Scottish heritage, which manifests differently, I've always been a colonizer. So I was like, oh, what is land? It doesn't matter. It matters a great, great deal. So in terms of Indigenous folks around the world, they control about 80% of the world's precious biodiversity that is always at risk. If they weren't safeguarding it, we'd be screwed kind of situation. This is especially true in the Amazon basin. And particularly true in the Amazon basin. We are in the process of researching the April topic for Colonizers World Tour, which is Brazil. And the indigenous tribes of Brazil are just doing a yeoman's job, and Brazil is making it very difficult for them.
Bolsonaro's made it a high hill.
Yeah.
They have to climb. Yeah.
They're doing their best. So there's lots of things around here. I mean, there's vital ancestral knowledge on how to like actually deal with the land and not conquer it. Because it's important to remember that when we conquered the indigenous peoples, we also like pillaged the physical land as well as the peoples. So there's a lot of eliminated biodiversity, especially in Central and South America. Even more so than in North America, which has rebounded in some ways from the research that I've done in a way that the Central and South has not. I know, for example, one of the key trees to, believe it or not, one of the major reasons that we can diagnose cancer on this planet is because of a tree. And that tree was greatly over-harvested. And now, it used to grow all the way around Central America. It now grows in one place on the Yucatan Peninsula. And the Mexican government, through the leadership of a couple of the local Aztec tribes, are being real fierce about guarding it. If we don't have that tree, we can't diagnose cancer. I'm not kidding. So it's a real important thing. Of course, you may have also heard of the Dakota Access Pipeline. That's been and the Keystone Pipeline. There is some ongoing protests in Hawaii around Manoa Kea. There's a lot of stuff like that and how we kind of do it. But since the indigenous peoples, you may remember this if you've joined us for Colonizers World Tour, the South Pacific Islands, there was a beauty pageant in 2009 entirely highlighting environmentalism, and those women all knew off the top of their head the relationship with the tribe, between the tribe and the land. I have no relationship to the land that I own. And I will be, right now it just frustrates me that I have to keep weeding it, just to be completely honest. And Dr. Aaron is a gardener and has more relationship. I have none. And so it's a good reminder to me to be aware of the land that I am on as we do this. And we have a lot to thank of the indigenous folks to keep that in mind.
Yeah, and I think, too, if anybody saw recently footage from the climate change conference in Europe, I forget where it was.
Scotland.
Oh, Glasgow. That's right. It was in Glasgow. There was a lot of high-profile pieces about indigenous folks that were there speaking about the land stewardship and protection, speaking about the threat. I think one of the indigenous politicians from somewhere in the South Pacific, I'm not going to remember this, gave his speech from the ocean because he wanted to highlight the rising water and, that it was going to disappear the island. So if you saw any of the coverage of that climate change conference and discussion, there was a lot of indigenous protests happening in Glasgow, and they're trying to be vocal about this relationship with the environment and the land and being stewards for the planet that is keeping us alive. Yeah. So we should maybe not try and kill it. Just some thoughts and feelings. We also wanted to bring up pop culture in this, and in the Google Docs, you will find, or live in Google Docs, lots of pretty neat recent videos done on the YouTubes. YouTube is great for that. BuzzFeed and Teen Vogue. Teen Vogue being like the social justice warrior of our times. Interviewed a bunch of Indigenous girls from North America to talk about pop culture and stereotypes and all that kind of stuff. The short end of that stick is that there's a real long tradition of misrepresentation and stereotyping based in racism. We talk about this a lot on our channel. We've talked about the ordeal of changing Native mascots and naming teams, sports teams in the United States, about naming them after Native tribes or stereotypes. You know, there's just a whole... if you don't know this history, we've got the Google Doc, but also I feel like a lot of people can understand some of the pretty terrible stereotypes we've developed in this country. There's a huge lack of any Native folks in traditional media where they have agency over how they're represented, which is one of the reasons why we wanted to cover Wild Indian tomorrow as well. It is starring Indigenous folks, made by a First Nations director and film producer. So we do have this new tradition of Indigenous folks representing themselves and telling stories they want to tell. I have lovingly called this the Waititi Effect, because Taika Waititi, as an Indigenous New Zealander, has, broken through the barrier of being a high-profile person who's made a lot of money for Marvel because he directed Thor Ragnarok, and then has this social cachet that he can spend. He then did Jojo Rabbit, which got nominated for Oscars and won lots of awards. So Taika is spending his social cachet by creating Indigenous work, supporting Indigenous work. He is one of the co-creators of the show Reservation Dogs, which landed on FX on Hulu in August of this year, along with Sterling Harjo, who's a Indigenous film producer and writer and storyteller. We've also got the aforementioned Rutherford Falls, which has, I think, like the first only Native writing team in the writer's room.
Yes.
And is a big step towards representation and acknowledging the way that they deal with colonialism on that show is genius. If I was teaching colonialism, I would just show episodes of that to my students and be like, this is what a colonial mindset is. Witness Ed Helms. But we also have talked a lot about
especially because it's a benevolent colonial mindset.
Yeah.
It's so, it's genius. Plus the fat girl gets the boy. So honestly, watch the show. Watch the show. It's so amazing.
Because Dustin Milligan from Schitt's Creek is in it. And yeah, we just love the Rutherford Falls from top to bottom. But we also have talked about this a lot, and Dr. K is the one of us that is looking at TikTok videos, but we have some links in the Google Docs to really significantly the rise of awareness in indigeneity and what it looks like and what it means through TikTok videos, through Insta stories, through Reels, through YouTube videos. There's a fantastic one that I watched that was this Indigenous, Native American woman who's a singer, and she sings and performs poetry and does videos about traditional makeup and style that's relevant to her tribe. She did this whole video about why braids are significant.
Yes.
And, it was genius. And so the beauty of the internet now, for all of its darkness, is that we are broadening our understanding because it's given... If you have the internet or a phone, you can have access to sharing your voice and your story. And so many Indigenous folks around the world are taking advantage of that platform. And I think you're getting, hopefully, this next generation of humans in Gen Z a lot more aware of Indigenous issues than previous generations because of it, which is just awesome.
Because there's no shortage of issues at all, honestly. Life expectancy of Indigenous folks is 20 years shorter than non-Indigenous folks. They account for, there's 5% of the population, but they're like 15 to 20% of the world's poorest communities. So it just isn't great. They often lack formal recognition. I'll speak especially here in the United States. You know, we make the joke about broken treaties and everything else, but if you are a West Wing watcher, in season three, the Thanksgiving episode is called Indians in the Lobby. And for all of Aaron Sorkin's foibles, it's a pretty good introduction to some of the problems and some of the ways that people want it addressed. And then, of course, we never talk about Indigenous folks ever again on West Wing, but at least they did. For like 20 whole minutes, we talked about Indigenous folks. Because the treaties are broken over and over and over and over again. There's legacies of inequality and exclusion. There's all these kind of networks of how difficult it is to report assault, both sexual and non, because of the relationship between tribal governments and local governments and what that all means. The COVID is that's a whole separate category, although they have nearly every tribe we've heard from has a higher vaccination rate than the non-tribes around them.
Yeah, they have, Indian country has the highest rate of vaccination.
Yeah. But if you think
any group, yeah.
If you think we're struggling with supply chain, let's talk about reservation supply chains.
Lord.
They're I saw a TikTok a couple days ago that I believe it's Montana. You have to drive around 7 hours to get a box of diapers. So have fun with that. Babies go through those pretty quick. There's some weird, and by weird, I just mean not in a judgy way, but it's a little bit messy about how land is actually owned. And because nobody cares enough on the white person side of these things to sit down and work this all out, things just are broken. They just don't work right. There are territories that overlap that shouldn't, honestly, between two tribes. There's territories that aren't. There's a lot of insecurity, full stop, insecure land tenure, who owns what for how long and who gets to say what is where. That's weird for a group of people who especially derive their entire identity from the land. So not only does the overlap and the lack of tenure and the lack of clarity affect the physical, how do we do life here? But imagine, we've already told you that the way they safeguard and pass down a lot of their legacy is through the land. Imagine what that does for the cultural legacy they're trying to pass on to their young people. They have a massive brain drain, young people who go to Western schools and then leave the reservation forever because there aren't opportunities on the reservation. And this is a problem in all diasporas, which I would very much like to classify some of these populations in diaspora because of how we've forced them to live. Whether they do that or not I am unclear, but to me there's so much, there's a lot of overlap in some diasporic elements, especially the Jewish diaspora and some of the indigenous diaspora and how that has worked. But imagine how there is such limited, which is why there's so beauty in young people, especially finding their indigeneity identity through social media and activism and everything else. But it's hard as shit. It's hard. And there is we don't have time. Honestly, these videos are supposed to be like 20 minutes. We're hitting 30 and we're not quite done yet. So there's just no system works right. Yeah. In terms of equity for Indigenous people. There's not a single system that works with the equity of Indigenous folks in mind. And so every intersection of human rights, oppression, violations, whatever, there is at least one, if not most, if not all, Indigenous tribes on the losing end of that equation.
For sure. And I think, we had planned at the end, I had planned, I should say, because I made the sheet that we are referencing as we talk about this, to talk about the influence of colonization on Indigenous folks. But I think we just have, because we've talked about all the ways in which what happens when you are forcibly removed from your land, when your food systems and are disrupted, when your medicine is destroyed, when your
children are kidnapped and shoved into industrial schools. We didn't even bring that up in this video, so
we didn't even get into that. Yeah, when your culture is erased or eradicated, when your people are brutalized and oppressed and stolen, That's all the legacies of colonialism. That is all when one people group comes to land for resources, be they people, natural resources, whatever, or just the land as a resource, and takes, then, the impact of that is unending. And that's one of the other things that I think I've learned in the last year is white people tend to talk about colonization as if it's something that happened. I think probably to make ourselves feel better, if I had to guess, keep those systems in place. But it's not, it's something that is ongoing. The project of colonization is ongoing. And the mindset of a colonizer is ongoing. And the impact of what we did and continue to do to Indigenous peoples around the world is ongoing. And, not only has ramifications for issues now, including, access to healthcare, medical treatment, diapers, climate change, all of that kind of stuff. But there's also the transgenerational, intergenerational trauma of that kind of both physical and cultural violence that I think will lead us into our discussion for Wild Indian tomorrow, which is a lot to do with grappling with intergenerational trauma and violence. But yeah, I think we can end with our Jeopardy facts. We ready for Jeopardy facts?
We are, in fact, ready for Jeopardy facts. So
away
mine is actually, I learned from Dr. Aaron, which is just honestly par for the course when it comes to indigeneity knowledge. And is the fact that headdresses, and whether this is all tribes or some tribes, I am not clear. Aaron can chime in, but but the kind of understanding of headdresses is that every feather on a headdress you earn. Mm-hmm. And I remember as we were talking about this yesterday in the car, that I remember being told that it was like the feathers for like the buffalo you killed, it was a warrior thing. And whether that's a stereotype or a truth, I'm not entirely sure, but that like triggered some childhood stuff. I was in the musical Annie Get Your Gun twice. So like, and the Chippewa the falsely named Chippewa are a huge, and there's an incredibly racist song in that musical about Indigenous folks. So, I remember the costume designers talking about headdresses. So, anywho's what's-its. But that it earns for more than violence is not something I would have ever thought about until you brought that up. And so I'm glad that that's my Jeopardy fun fact, that it is a mark. That part of the reason that it's terrible when we who are not Indigenous wear them is not just because it's general appropriation, but because it's honorific appropriation. And that's really, stop. We should stop.
We should stop. Yeah. To my knowledge, it is, you have to earn them in every culture that uses them.
Okay.
To answer your question, and to every tribe or nation that uses them or that has them as a ceremonial artifact. That is not every tribe or nation. That is one of the, if you watch in our oft-referenced Google Doc below, it was in I learned it from the Teen Vogue, or relearned it, I believe it was something I knew, from the Teen Vogue piece about 6, misconceptions about Indigenous people. And they were like poking a hole in the idea that all of them wear headdresses. They do not ceremonially. But yeah, I think that's the thing for me that stuck with me too, is that it's not just appropriation. Like, to watch these young women talk about a tradition that's very important to them and say, like, but you haven't earned those feathers. Yeah. And I was like, ooh, we've got to stop with that. Cough, cough, Kansas City Chiefs, looking at you. My Jeopardy fact is that prior to doing this Indigenous knowledge, both for myself and for Abby Research, I did not understand the distinction between being indigiqueer, having a queer identity as an Indigenous person is the big word we use now, between indigiqueer and two-spirit. Because I've seen a lot of times, hashtags missing, murdered, and Indigenous women and girls two-spirit. You see it attached to the LGBTQ alphabet acronym. But I didn't really understand, and it was, I believe, in all my relations podcasts on Indigiqueer that I listened to, but also in the research for this video that I learned. So you may have heard of the term Two-Spirit. If not, I'm going to explain it right now. It's a contemporary umbrella term that refers to the historic and current Indigenous people groups whose Indigenous people, whose individual spirits were a blend of female and male spirits, hence two spirits. But it's not the same. Not every Indigenous queer person is two-spirit.
Got it.
You can be two-spirit and straight. You can be two-spirit and lesbian. Like, it's not this. They overlap, but they're not. One is not the umbrella term for all of them. It's been Two-Spirit in a lot of ways has been reclaimed by LGBT Native American communities in order to honor the heritage, and to also in a lot of ways to provide an alternative to Western labels of gay, lesbian, or transgender as well. So, to end this video, finally, you guys, if you're still watching, God love you. I think it's so important to remember, like, we've done some research on this. We cannot speak for any Indigenous people group, never mind all of them. They all have different words and phrases and languages that they use. Some might use Two-Spirit as an umbrella for everything. Some might not. So our best advice to end this Indigenous Peoples 101 is to start with our Google Doc, click a video or an article that sounds interesting, and learn about a people group. Learn about the Chamorro people in Guam. Learn about the Apache rights of womanhood. Like, pick one and learn about them, and learn what you can about that group. And make sure not to say then, oh, I know about, coming of age rituals in Native Americans. You learned about it in the Apache tribe. So make sure you don't then equate that knowledge to all things Indigenous. Because as we said, there's a flip ton of Indigenous people groups out there. So we got some learning to do.
And if you have enjoyed so far listening to our video and we've been helpful in your learning process, we have lots of videos that hopefully help in your learning process. Make sure to hit subscribe and hit that bell to always so that you never miss any of our content regarding Indigenous peoples around the world, because every land has them except for Antarctica. And we have a video on that too, so you should watch that to learn why. In the meantime, please comment below and let us know what you think about this. We really do appreciate it. If you have resources that we need to add to that list, my gracious, we would love to have them. Guam is one of the places we know a lot more about because a Chamorro gentleman made sure to give us all of the information that we didn't have and fill in a lot of blanks for us. We were really, really grateful for that. In the meantime, I'm Dr. Kristen.
I'm Dr. Erin.
This has been a special edition of Colonizer's World Tour, and we'll see you next time.
Bye.